Politics, the Constitution, voting.
The Anarcho-Christian Podcast, evaluating the relationship between the Christian and the state.
Give us a king to rule us when you're gone. His life's work had been to help the people understand it's not the role of a man to rule over other men.
Politics, the Constitution, voting. These are major topics in anarchist circles. But why should we be interested in them at all? I invited Mike Maharrey onto the show to see if we could answer this question. You may recognize Mike's name from his role as the communications director of the 10th Amendment Center and his many appearances on libertarian podcasts such as The Tom Woods Show, The Lions of Liberty, and The Gold Standard with Alan Mosley. He is also the mind behind Godarchy, which is one of my favorite websites and podcasts. If you haven't checked it out already, I'll have a link to it in the show notes. So, Mike and I have messaged each other before online, but we recently got the chance to sit down and talk about some things where our projects overlap. This is sort of a part 2 for an episode that we did together for Mike's podcast, Godarchy. We discussed anarcho-Christian and my faith and my political opinions. As well, I wanted to have him on this show to discuss a question that keeps getting thrown at me. If you're an anarchist, why do you care about politics? I think we had a great discussion, and I really value Mike's insight and experience. So, without further delay, here is my conversation with Mike Maharrey about politics. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. So I'm very excited to have Mike Maharrey from Godarchy and the 10th Amendment Center on to talk about politics and the Constitution and stuff like that. So, Mike, how you doing?
You know, half your audience just turned off this show. I don't want to talk about politics.
Well, that's exactly why I want to have you on and talk about this, because that is something that, and I'm sure that you get that too with Godarchy, that I'm always hearing posted somewhere on one of the social media pages or something. And you're an anarchist. Why are you talking about politics? And so I thought the best person to talk to here would be Mike Maharrey, because you have done a lot of work with something called the 10th Amendment Center. So,
yeah, indeed.
Would you mind telling us, I guess, before we get into answering that question, maybe tell us a little bit about the 10th Amendment Center and what it does and what you do with them?
Yeah, absolutely. So the 10th Amendment Center is I don't know what to call it. We used to call it ourselves a think tank, but that's a dumb word, so we don't use that anymore. It's an organization that was actually started in 2006, and basically it's all about constitutional fidelity and political decentralization. And Michael Bolden founded the 10th Amendment Center back in, like I said, 2006, in the wake of 9/11 and the Bush years. And he kind of did it, honestly, to hold a mirror up to the right, who always talks about being limited government for the Constitution, but they were all gung-ho about the Patriot Act and all of the unconstitutional wars and all of those types of things. And so the 10th Amendment Center has two basic, I guess, streams of activity. One is education. We talk about the Constitution. We talk about what it was intended to mean. So we are constitutional originalists in the sense of what it meant and how it was understood when it was ratified. And so we talk about those things and founding principles and whatnot. And then we do a lot of actual political activism, and that is primarily centered around using state and local political power to undermine federal authority. So we use this wonderful thing called nullification, which is an idea actually that was kind of formalized by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. The idea is that states have the authority to basically nullify unconstitutional federal acts. And in reality, it's a tool that can be used to kind of break up the monopoly power that the federal government has achieved for itself over the last 100 years or so. A good example, just to understand where we're coming from practically, is the marijuana issue. The federal government still claims that marijuana is that marijuana is illegal throughout the United States, and yet we have 33 states that have medical marijuana legalized. We have, I think, 10 states now that have completely legalized marijuana, despite federal prohibition. And what we have found is that when states simply start ignoring federal law, they stop enforcing federal law. The federal government doesn't have the resources or the personnel to enforce its mandates or implement its programs. So when states withdraw from cooperation with the federal government can't do what it needs to do. I want to make this very clear. It's not that we believe states are great and wonderful, or that local governments are somehow, good. It's really about decentralization. Political power exists. That's a reality that we have to deal with in the world. So are we better off with monopoly power, or are we better off with a lot of competing power centers that can jostle with each other, provide escape routes? If one place is particularly oppressive, you can go to a different place. I believe that decentralization is a pragmatic, practical key toward broadening liberty. When governments have to compete against each other, they're less effective, they're less obtrusive, and it gives us ways to fight the overwhelming power. So that's kind of it in a nutshell, that we use that constitutional structure that is in place as kind of a tool to challenge power and decentralize it and try to narrow its power and scope down. Ultimately, we'd love to have it decentralized all the way down to the individual, but we've got obviously a long way to go until we get to that point.
Right. So what is it about the 10th Amendment that I guess is the thing to focus on? Because all we see on TV is the Second Amendment, right? Or maybe even the First Amendment about freedom of speech, right? So, then there's a bunch of other amendments that we don't even know what they're talking about. And then there's this 10th one here. Why is it that that's the focus? Why isn't the focus on, the First Amendment or something like that?
Well, Thomas Jefferson called the 10th Amendment the foundation of the Constitution, the cornerstone of America's political system. And the irony is it doesn't really do anything. It doesn't have any specific power to it. It is what is known as a rule of construction. And in the legal world, a rule of construction tells you how to read a document. And that's all the 10th Amendment was. Actually, the Constitution would operate the same way whether the 10th Amendment was there or not. It made something explicit, already implicit in the political structure. And basically, if people don't know, people that want to ignore politics, the 10th Amendment basically just says that any power that was not specifically delegated to the federal government remains with the states or the people. So in other words, the federal government has a limited scope of power. It has specific things that were enumerated. If you go to Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, you'll find a list of things that Congress can do. Congress is only supposed to do those things. There aren't very many of them. I've heard people say, and it depends on how you kind of divide it up, but there's between 20 and 25 specific powers that the federal government actually has. That's it. The federal government's not supposed to be involved in healthcare. It's not supposed to be involved in minimum wage laws. It's not supposed to be involved in education. All of these things were supposed to be handled at the state or the local level. And again, it's not that state governments are great. State governments suck too. But when you have 50 states, you have competing jurisdictions. You can decide where you want to be. You can look at experiments that happened. It was de Tocqueville that called the United States system 50 laboratories of experimentation. So again, the emphasis for me is that decentralization is better than centralization. Centralized authority, the more centralized it becomes, the more detrimental it is to our liberty. So the 10th Amendment is, in effect, a decentralizing statement. It says Federal government, you have this very small, limited amount of power. States, local governments, you have much broader powers. Federal government, stop doing all this crap. That's it in a nutshell.
So why are we talking about it? Why? The question is, why, if you're anarchist, why are you talking about it? And maybe even more importantly, when someone's pointing that out and we're having a conversation about the Constitution, why are we talking about the Constitution, right? Because we don't believe in, this sort of binding contract that we didn't sign and things like that. So why are we even talking about it?
Well, I think there are two, what's the word I'm looking for? Two things that we need to do as anarchists, as libertarians. The first thing is educate, to teach people about liberty, to communicate the principles of liberty. And there's a lot of people that are doing a great job out there of doing that through podcasts, through writing, through all of the different means. And you can't underestimate that. For people to embrace liberty, they have to understand what liberty means. They have to understand the principles. You have to understand the idea of non-aggression and all of these things that we talk about and that you don't learn in your government schooling. So that's important. And I think some you don't believe in the political activism part of it. The system in America is supposed to be a certain way. I think there's value in pointing out that it's not that way. I mean, you can kind of take the Spooner approach and point at this. This is what was promised, and this is what we got. So maybe you should reconsider how this system works. I think there's value in that as well as an educational tool. But then, for me personally, I'm a pragmatic person. I want more liberty. I want to live my life today in a more free way. And I believe that the Constitution, because it is quote unquote the law of the land, it is the system that we are supposed to be working within, that it provides an opportunity for political activism that will increase liberty. Again, going states legalizing marijuana, there are less people that are in cages because of a plant today than there would have been if those states hadn't taken any political action. That is a practical step towards more liberty. People say, well, now you've got all these state laws and taxes and all that. I get it. It's not ideal. But the bottom line is there are less people in cages. There are now people who can get marijuana for medical conditions that couldn't before, that had to risk arrest in order to relieve their pain. So I think that is a net positive for liberty. And there's a Rothbard quote that I like to throw at the hardcore anarchists. He said this. He said, libertarians must come to realize that parroting ultimate principles is not enough for coping with the real world. I live in a real world where there's a real government that is trampling on my rights. I live in a real world where a government is engaging in unconstitutional wars. I live in a real world where people are being locked in cages because of a plant, or being denied medication because the FDA says you can't have this, or who are interfering with the education system. If we can push back against that, if we can diminish the power of that government, then I think it's a net step toward liberty. And that's how I've chosen to engage in the system. I get it. There are people that say, I'm not going to engage in the system at all. I had Lou Sander on my show, Godarchy, a couple of months ago, and he was advocating for, gray markets, black markets, basically withdrawing from the government as much as possible. I think there's value in that strategy. As libertarians, as voluntarists, anarchists, however we want to label ourselves, we have to make decisions about how we want to engage the system. And this is how I've chosen to do it. And, I'm a little bit biased because I say often that the 10th Amendment is a gateway drug, because that's how I came into the liberty movement. I was the neocon that was brought up in this Republican world that talked about limited government and revered the Constitution. That was kind of my political worldview. That's probably half of the United States, right? Mm-hmm. Well, I started to realize that the system that we have isn't what was promised. So that starts you thinking. And then it exposed me to these other ideas and set me down the path that ultimately led to the political worldview that I have now. So I think there's value in talking about decentralization, talking about this idea of nullification, because it teaches people that, you know what, you can resist the government without resorting to shooting. Mm-hmm. That there are ways that we can push back. I use Rosa Parks as an example a lot. She was a nullifier. She said, "I'm not getting up out of this bus seat. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to settle for this unjust law." So I think there's value in communicating that to a broader message. Lou Sander has some great ideas, but if he goes into a Tea Party group and starts talking about black and gray markets, they're not going to listen to him.
Right.
They'll listen to me. And, I can sneak some subversive things into this Constitution and 10th Amendment talk, and hopefully, like I said, set some practical steps forward. And it's interesting because, Hans Hermann Hoppe, who I don't think anybody's going to challenge his credentials as a libertarian thinker, he's talked about the importance of decentralization, of local action, of ignoring the bigger government and using smaller governments to dilute that power. So, if Hoppe and Rothbard think that this is a good strategy, well, it can't be all bad, I don't think.
No, agreed. And, I did an episode recently about Paul addressing some of those legal things within the Roman government throughout the New Testament. Mm-hmm. Whenever he was apprehended, and he would use his Roman citizenship to be able to speak to certain people that are within the government and show a lot of inconsistency there, which is a big thing that you've brought up, and that was a big part of my journey into this, and it was seeing that inconsistency. The more that I got into this idea of reading the Constitution and how wonderful it was, and then finding people like Spooner that just kind of hit you across the face, and you can't argue it anymore. And I think it is important, like you said, to have that conversation and to kind of show where the current system is not following the way that it said that it was going to follow it. And then that is a whole nother reason to question the system at all.
Right. But, again, I take a little bit of issue with the famous Spooner quote when he says this was either what was intended, paraphrasing, this was either what was intended or it was helpless to prevent it. So either way, it's useless. Right. And there's this notion packaged in that somehow the Constitution was going to enforce itself, that you're going to write down a bunch of words on some parchment and the government's going to look at that and go, okay, we're going to follow that. Well, that was never the intent. And it's interesting, if you go back to the ratification debates of the Constitution, they asked this question. You're telling us that this new central government is going to be limited. Well, how do you do it? How is that going to happen? And James Madison actually, in one of the Federalist Papers, gave us a blueprint. And one of the things he said was a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union, that it could bring down unwarranted federal actions. And we've seen it happen. I used the marijuana example. I think the best historical example is actually the nullification of the Fugitive Slave Act in the 1850s, when the federal government basically was enforcing fugitive slave rendition. It was doing aggressively trying to bring runaway slaves back to the South, and the northern states passed personal liberty laws. They ignored the Supreme Court. They refused to cooperate with the slave catchers, and it drastically decreased the number of black people that were forced back into slavery, or in some cases that they were trying to kidnap, and they were legitimately free to begin with. So this is a way to practically advance liberty. The problem is that somewhere along the line, people decided, well, we're not going to refuse to cooperate with officers of the Union. We're going to do whatever these people tell us to do. And that's where the problem is. Anything has to have an enforcement mechanism. You can't just write down words. And again, Madison talked about this. He called them parchment barriers. Parchment barriers are useless. There has to be some enforcement mechanism. And I think a lot of the problem with the Constitution is the fact that people aren't willing to enforce it. And now it's gotten to the point that the federal government is so big and powerful that it does anything it wants. Now, we can have the separate discussion of whether or not it's ethically or morally legitimate to bind people with a document they never signed. That's a completely different discussion. And when we get to that discussion, I agree completely with Spooner and those that reject this silly notion of a social contract. It's interesting because even Jefferson was kind of onto this even back in that time. He was talking about, maybe we shouldn't be trying to bind future generations with these laws. But nevertheless, the point is we have a world that we live in. How are we going to engage that world? And there's basically two choices. You can choose not to engage it at all. And for people who choose that, I'm not one of these people, well, you've got to do, no, you've got to decide how you want to engage it. And I've chosen the path of activism because I've seen it as effective. I'm very supportive of those who refuse to engage in it as well. I'm not dogmatic either way. I get frustrated when people want to say, well, you have to do it this way. Well, no, I don't.
So the way that they say that we can have a voice besides just nullification and sitting things out, civil disobedience, or having activism within things like the 10th Amendment Center is voting. Mm-hmm. So could I just get your opinion on voting? I guess let me preface it further with, within anarchism, there's a big movement to say that voting is violence. And that's a great little phrase. A lot of times it needs to be, teased out a little bit and explained exactly when and what and how and all that. But I really would like to get your opinion on voting.
Yeah, I mostly think it's a waste of time. And the reason is, especially at the federal level. So there's a lot of layers to this. I'm not necessarily anti-voting. I'm very sympathetic to the voting is violence argument, but I think you can also make a case for defensive voting. I think when you start talking about the president, when you start talking about Congress, anything at the federal level, I think it's an absolute waste of time to vote because the system is so broken that no matter what pieces you put into it, it's not going to make any difference. It's like having a broken down car that's on blocks and changing the driver. Mm-hmm. Until you get the car running right, doesn't matter who's in the driver's seat. So I don't vote in federal. Haven't in ages, and that just kind of goes to the whole 10th Amendment Center mentality. We used to joke, and it wasn't a joke. You should never call the 202 area code. Just basically ignore Washington D.C. We're trying to limit these guys, quit playing the game, and so And the other thing that I've always said is you vote the bums out, and you wake up the next day and realize you just put in a bunch of new bums.
Right.
So from a pragmatic strategy standpoint, I don't think voting in federal elections is worth your trip to the voting booth. That said, I think that there can be a case made for voting in state or local elections where your vote may actually have more of an impact. There were a number of state legislative races in Kentucky last year that came down to a handful of votes. So you can make an argument that your vote might actually make a difference. I'm still a little wary of it. I kind of have that queasy feeling in my throat. A lot of this is because I don't trust politicians. I feel like pretty much anybody who has embarked on that path wants to impose their will on other people, and I really have a hard time supporting them. So I probably sound kind of wishy-washy. I guess what it is I'm just not a dogmatic person. I'm not going to tell you should not vote.
Right.
I just not my place. Me personally, I won't vote in a federal election. I probably won't vote in a state election. I might vote in a local election, particularly if there's a particular issue. Like in Lexington, I've been real involved in surveillance activism. I did vote for a city council member in the last election who was supportive of the surveillance work. It was very much a pragmatic, practical vote for that one issue. I would definitely support voting on referendums, where there's like a tax increase on the ballot. I don't have any ethical problem with that at all. And Tom Woods has used the analogy before, and I think there's some validity to it. If you were a slave and you had the opportunity to vote for an undertaker who is going to whip you 5 times a day and an overseer that's going to whip you 1 time a day, well, regardless, you're still getting an overseer, but I'd rather get whipped once a day than 5 times a day. So I think you can make a ethical argument for defensive voting as well. So that's why I'm not real dogmatic. But for me personally, I'm just not much of a voter. In fact, the last election that had that was like state and national candidates, I actually went to the polls and submitted a blank ballot because in Kentucky they actually count undercounts. So like if there's a ballot and you don't vote for in a given election, it counts that as an undercount. So in a sense, you can vote none of the above in Kentucky. So I went and did that just for fun. But that's
cool.
nerdy. That's nerdy. Yeah. And all states don't do it. A lot of states will just throw a blank ballot out, but in Kentucky it does get counted as vote cast, and it will show that there was a vote cast and there was not a vote cast for candidate A, B, and C. So yeah. So well, I did that.
It is a very complex issue. And you're right. People do kind of square off on all sides of it. This is the way it has to be. This is the way to win, or this is the way to be completely consistent. And it's an interesting topic for me. Someone who has voted before and then also has sat out the vote before too.
Yeah.
I think it's a good conversation. I think it's something that needs to be thought of more, and it's could be used for good reasons, good methods behind it, but also that it's not this end all system. As long as we get everybody to vote the way that we want, it's going to fix everything.
I have this visceral reaction to people when they start with, if you don't vote, you don't have any right to talk, and you don't have it. Those people just absolutely drive me nuts. Right. And I'll get pretty hardcore. I'll just take the never vote position just to antagonize those people. Right. Because that just absolutely drives me crazy. And I really, I think philosophically, I mean, you can boil it down to, you could argue that you're consenting to this. I get the arguments against voting, and I'm sympathetic to them. I can't be that dogmatic on that particular issue. I've got other hills I would rather die on. But when people start in on that, you've got to vote, got to register to vote. If you don't vote, and I'm like, yeah, I'm not doing that.
Well, Mike, I wanted to have this conversation because I really do find it as a continuation to the conversation I started with the idea of citizenship in Rome and the things that we find Paul saying in the New Testament. Yeah. And then kind of taking that conversation and now also looking at where we are, how our system works, and this idea of, keeping an eye on it, keeping it accountable if we should, is it valuable, all those things. And so I hope that's what all the listeners will kind of take away from all this.
And I think like a lot of things, my thinking on this has been somewhat of an evolution. The more I have gotten involved with my Godarchy project, which is kind of a side project, but the more I've read, the more I've kind of considered theological ramifications, the more sympathetic I become to the idea of just withdrawing and not being a part of this system at all. I can see the appeal to that. It's like pacifism to me. I'm drawn to it, but I'm not quite there.
Right.
Maybe you talk to me in 5 years and I've quit the 10th Amendment Center and called Michael Bolden a heretic or something. But at this point, I feel like that there is value in the work that we're doing, and so I'm going to continue to do it. And I guess some people will say, well, God, Mike is awful wishy-washy on this, and maybe that's a fair statement, but I think we like things to be black and white, and things aren't necessarily black and white. We kind of have to pick our path. And so, I commend those folks out there who have gotten to the point that, they just don't engage in it at all. And they're doing other things to try to make the world more free that's outside of the political process. Because I said this earlier, or maybe it was when in the episode that you and I did together for my show. Politics by its very nature is adversarial, and it's not a healthy way to have a society when we're divided up and fighting and trying to gain power over each other. So the more that we can do to break that system up and expose the violence inherent in the system, to borrow a Monty Python phrase, I think that's important. And that's what I'm really trying to do with Godarchy. I'm trying to kind of hold up, mirror up to the system and a mirror up to people, and try to make them own the violence that they're invoking, because most people aren't aware of it. They think, well, I'm doing a good thing because I'm for gun control, or I'm for, welfare, or I'm for this or that. And they don't realize that ultimately what they're doing is they're pointing a gun at another person and saying, you must do things my way. Absolutely. And that's, I want to get to the point that that's not the way society is. I want a kingdom of God where we love one another, we serve one another, where we honor our neighbors, but we're not there yet. So we have to figure out how we can engage in the world in the way it is. And right now, I'm engaging it with the 10th Amendment Center, and we'll see what happens.
Absolutely, and I do really respect the work that I've seen come out of the 10th Amendment Center. And
we're awesome. I mean, if you're into practical politics, I don't know that there's anybody that's doing more. I say that in all seriousness, and yes, I'm bragging a little bit, but we have seen practical impacts with the work that we're doing in a number of issues. And, particularly, I think in the realm of surveillance, we've got a really cool thing that is growing force with the legislator in West Virginia. His name is Pat McKeon, who is kind of a Ron Paul disciple himself. And he has developed this piece of legislation called Defend the Guard, which would basically prohibit the deployment of National Guard troops without a declaration of war. And so, there's a way that at the state level we could put a little chink in the warfare state. So I think things like that are amazing moves forward. And if nothing else, to get people talking about anti-war, talking about the warfare state. So, those are the kinds of things we're doing. And if you don't do practical politics, then you can make fun of me. And that's fine. If you do practical politics, check out what we're doing at 10thamendmentcenter.com. And, maybe that's a place that you would want to get involved or support.
Yeah, and I'm definitely a junkie on the politics, and even though apparently I'm not supposed to have any interest in it whatsoever, I am, for better or worse. I'm always paying attention to it. But another thing, before we sign off here, another thing that I pay attention to is Godarchy. So please let everyone know about Godarchy and where we can find it.
Yeah, godarchy.org is the website. And I can't even remember when I started it. I started it basically because I was so frustrated with the warmongering in the church. I wanted there to be an anti-war voice. That's kind of how it started. And then it turned into this place where I just muse about, in some ways, it's almost like me publicly working out my political and theological views in writing. Writing is my first love, so that's kind of where it started. I finally started the Godarchy podcast. I guess we're getting close to a year now that I've been doing it. And you can find all the links to the shows over at godarchy.org. Like I said, it's kind of a side project, but it's really my heart and soul and passion. And you'll find a lot of stuff, like I said, where I really focus in on this idea of violence. Government is violence. And as Christians, we are to eschew violence. And so I think that's a huge message that is missing in modern theology and modern churches. So that's what I'm doing over there. podcast comes out every other week, and I haven't been writing as much just with life stuff going on, but there's quite a few articles there that you can check out. And I've written about the Romans 13, and I've written a good bit about the theology of war and things that Jesus taught. So yeah, check it out.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I will have the links to that, and I read all the articles whenever they come out. I subscribe to the podcast too, and so I think everyone listening should do the same thing. There's a lot to get from Mike and from everything that you're doing, sir. So I appreciate the time today. Man, we're going to have to do it again.
Absolutely. It's been fun.
So, what did you think? Is there room for activism and political interest in anarchism? What do you think about voting? Is it violence? Or is there a case for defensive voting? And what are your thoughts on the Constitution? Let me know on social media. I'd like to thank Mike for having me on his show and taking the time out for this discussion. I'll have links to his projects and the episodes that we discussed in the show notes. Don't forget to subscribe to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast on whatever podcatcher you're using. If you're not sure where to find us, visit anarchochristian.com/subscribe. There you'll find links to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Android, Google Play, and YouTube. If you're enjoying the podcast, please consider letting us know by leaving a 5-star rating and review on iTunes or wherever you catch the episodes. Also, like and share the episodes on Facebook and the other social media sites. You can support the show with a monthly donation through Patreon. Thank you, The Clinger, for becoming our newest patron. Visit the support tab on anarchochristian.com. That will take you to our Patreon page where you'll find a few ways that you can support us. And thank you again, Clinger, for your financial support. So I think that's it for today. Grace and peace. No king but Christ.
He cried out to God, won't you help them to believe? This power is illusion, the need to rule is greed. Your love and your light is really all they need. It's really all we need.
Thank you for listening to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast. Subscribe to our email notifications at anarchochristian.com, like us on facebook.com/anarchochristian, and follow us on Twitter at anarchoxp. Subscribe to our podcast and YouTube to join us next time as we continue to evaluate the relationship between the Christian and the state. No king but Christ.
This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.